This is me 90 feet under. My presentation tonight will be on what poverty, 90 feet under, what poverty does to people. And just as an overview here, I'm going to stick to 3 different categories and 3 different areas. This has to do with the impacts of poverty on people. And we'll take a look at the internal part of things. In other words, what's going on, how people are impacted internally. Also, we'll talk about discourse and how discourse is affected, and also about the hidden rules of poverty, class rules, that is, and how they affect people. And there's much more to it, but I thought we'll skip to these points, and then if there are things we can even we can entertain those at any time or later on. So, as a general rule, what we sort of, as a person being in poverty, and as if you belong, let's say, a family of 4, and that family of 4 is making $26,000 a year. If you're under that, then you are living in poverty, and in this country. And what that means is that you don't have enough for your family to go around. So you're always going to be doing without something. That has to do with food, clothing, shelter, pharmaceuticals, or maybe all of those things. And so it begins to be that the pressure is on if you are living in poverty, the conditions that you see here. I'd like to start off early reminding all of ourselves how close our DNA is throughout humanity. We're about 99.5% the same, and even the differences there are not distributed racially. So we get this human distribution of genes, and the thing is that genetically it's hard to pick out just by looking at the human genome. It's hard to figure out who is what race. So I will be talking mainly about poverty today and very little about race. That's not going to come into this particular talk. But I just wanted to make this point early, that we know that the distribution of genes throughout humanity is basically equal. Now, that doesn't mean we're all the same, but the changes will be distributed equally. Excuse me. What I started doing about a year after it was a couple of years after I retired from teaching, involved with poverty. I'm going to get rid of these things for a second. Can you see okay? Okay. And after a couple of years of working with several groups in the city and trying to figure out what was going on with poverty, what I had to do was go by myself. I'm an introvert, and the way I can best figure things out sometimes is to go by myself and sit down and get a pencil and paper. And I started making a list of things that I saw that were true of people in poverty, and things that I had read about. I came across an amazing study in which, this was the Hart Risley study from the Kansas University, where these 2 social scientists, one was a psychologist, discovered that kids in poverty have half the vocabulary of middle-class children. So I wrote that down, and I said, well, it's number 2 on my list. I knew that kids in poverty and their parents also make decisions based on survival. And this is forced because you never have enough. And so you plug gaps here. You don't have food, then you let everything drop and you go find food. If you need clothing, you go in that direction. The third thing I wrote down on my list was that kids in poverty speak in casual register. Well, middle-class kids and kids who live in wealth speak in formal register. And as I looked at these three things, I thought to myself, genes are distributed evenly across humanity. Why would we see this disparity? So I kept writing a list, and I wound up coming up with, well, this was the list of 90. I came up with 90 impacts eventually. Sorry to spring all of this on you at once. You can feel free at any time if you want to take a screenshot or with your iPhone, take a picture or something like that. Feel free to do that with any of these. And we're going to come back to this list later on so that you can, after I talk for a while, we'll come back and then you can maybe pick out some words or some topics that you might like to ask about. But I thought that these 90 impacts really were true of people in poverty. And I haven't found any that I was wrong on about this. I think that all of these things are generally what you find for people in poverty, particularly for people and kids who are in generational poverty. That's where you're in poverty for more than one generation. So we'll get back to this. I'm going to cover some specific topics first. And as I mentioned, if you want to ask anything about these, well, is there anything that you see right now that you might like to ask about, or? I mean, some word that struck you. All right, no matter, we'll come back to it. And so the first thing I want to talk about are microscopic effects. In other words, the impacts of poverty internally, poverty and body cells. So what happens here is that you have the stressors of poverty, and there are many coming from all these different directions now. They invade the body. And the way I envision this happening is this: you get this stressors. Let's say if you're dealing with hunger over a period of weeks, that's going to be a major stressor. And there are many other stressors that you could run into here. So stress, then, well, we take that in and so our brain cells get a hold of this information, our neurons, and then the neurons take that and they have this wonderful highway to distribute this stress now to every part of your body, literally every part of your body. And that highway is the central nervous system. So now your brain cells can take this all to all of those cells down to, let's say, the chromosomes, whatever they are. Well, we'll get back to those in a second. And then your chromosomes can respond by, for instance, what we call DNA aging. In other words, early morbidity, which can turn into early mortality too. And this can happen from the stressors that we see here. Well, let's see how the chromosomes are affected by poverty. Now, I'm going to, let me get this here. There, little laser, follow the bouncing ball here. And I'll keep this diagram. I know there's a lot to look at. We'll keep it as simple as possible here. If you look in this section, you see here a body cell, okay? And your body is made up of about 37.5 trillion of these body cells. Inside each body cell are your chromosomes. And a chromosome, one of your chromosomes will look basically like this. And there's a little part down here that's called a telomere that we'll look at right now. One of the jobs of the chromosome is this: if your body cells are starting to get ineffective, maybe they're getting a little sickly, they wear out. What happens is the chromosome detects that, and it will tell the body cell to divide in two. So what happens then, the cell divides in two, and then the old cell gets absorbed back into the body. Sometimes those old cells get used for other things too. But then the new cell is nice and fresh. and that carries off and it gives you your good health. And that's if things are going well. But in poverty, with the lack of food and shelter, and with plenty of fear, plenty of uncertainty, and not having things that you generally need to get on in life, and all these stressors piled on, what happens is sometimes the chromosome isn't able to do what it's supposed to do. And then when the cell gets divided in two, sometimes the cell is not as healthy as it's supposed to be, the new one. What happens then is the body starts to send in help to get the cell healthy. And the body does that by way of fluids. It starts sending in fluids. The fluids can't penetrate the cell, so you get a buildup of inflammation. And that leads to things like Crohn's disease, celiac disease, cardiovascular problems, immune cell problems. So plenty of issues can come up here if this chromosome is not doing its job correctly. And something interesting that's happened in recent years is in this area of this little spot here called the telomere at the end. If the chromosome has a nice, healthy, long telomere, then that's a good indicator that the chromosome is doing its job. But as the telomeres start to get shorter, the chromosome will not be doing its job well. The cell division doesn't go right. You don't get healthy cells. And we find more and more people now, for instance, people with poverty, who now start to suffer from early morbidity and then, of course, early mortality. So one of the things we can do now is actually fairly easily measure the telomeres from a person's chromosomes, and we can find out whether or not we can expect healthy chromosomes in that. So, but what happens with the chromosomes in poverty is the stressors get down here and they start to cause problems that can lead to some of the sicknesses and the illnesses that I talked about before, mentioned by name before, and many more. And also some of these illnesses will start to can happen in clusters too. So that's what's going on with the chromosomes. Well, there's more to it though. At the same time that that's going on, remember there are 90 impacts at the same time. Stressors of poverty invade the body, and stress then comes in, we detect it, we may smell it, we may think it, we may hear it. Stress comes in many forms. Our brain takes that in, again, passes it on to the neurons, their brain cells, the brain cells pass that on to, let's say, the HPA axis. That's your hypothalamic pituitary adrenal cortical axis. And that is responsible for, if that's in trouble, that is responsible for delivering cortisol. Recently, we've begun to learn all of the problems that we can find with too much cortisol in the blood. If this child, let's say, lives in poverty and is going to be subject to the undue stressors that our family is too, we're going to see more incidences of her having to deal with depression, either hers or somebody in her family's. Trauma seems to be a regular visitor for kids in poverty. Fear, abuse. Poverty is the #1 predictor of child abuse. Fight, flight, freeze. There's a gunshot down the street. This kid may go into fight, flight, freeze. Well, any of these things is going to bring on poor delivery from the HPA axis. And if that's the case, what's going to happen that we notice with kids like this, your stress regulation gets impaired. And their cognitive skills are diminished. This happens in part because cortisol, once it gets in the blood for a child like this, when they get to school, the cortisol will tend to stay in the blood for probably 2 to 5 hours, maybe even longer, depending on the incident. And so a kid who goes to school suffering from any of these things, and there could be others at the same time, if cortisol is in the blood, she's going to have a hard time learning. And if this happens on a lot of occasions, the learning is going to be affected longer term. So this also is going on at the same time that what you saw going on with the chromosomes may be going on. And living in poverty also can bring about a situation like this, where the stressors sometimes turn off some of the genes. Some of the genes get silenced. So the on and off switches for genes, which have all kinds of functions in the body, some genes even regulate other genes. But if some genes get turned off, and some other genes may get turned on then errantly, then what happens is you get a situation that's referred to as epigenesis. Epigenetic changes mean genes where now you've got the on-off switches, not what they were before. And that can lead to problems with the executive functions being impaired. And those are your skills for planning, memory, flexibility, and impulse control. So you get this kid thinking, you're saying to yourself, why can't I get this stuff? Well, it's probably up in here someplace, or with one of the issues, maybe chromosomes, and maybe the HPA axis being affected, maybe all of those things. Poverty brings on the stressors that can do all of these things. So, and this just really starts scratching the surface of what could be going on inside the body for a kid who lives in poverty and for adults who live in poverty. While that's going on, there's some other changes here that go on. One of the ones I mentioned has to do with discourse, how we talk to each other, how we communicate with each other. Every language in the world really has 5 registers, and 2 registers are the ones that get used the most. One is formal register, and that typically tends to be the discourse of middle class, school, and business. It's also the language of wealth. Casual register tends to be the discourse of poverty. And the interesting thing about this is that it doesn't seem to be which country you're in or which language it is or which culture. The discourse of middle class, school, and business tends to be formal register, and the discourse of poverty tends to be casual register. Now, there's some good reasons why that happens, and we want to take a look at those here. Formal register, pressed the wrong button, sorry. Formal register is really efficient, and it's used then for tasks like school, business, or those are some areas where we need efficient language. But casual register is used for relationships. In other words, it's the kind of register you use at lunchtime when you get together with everybody, and maybe you don't speak in complete sentences. You may start at the beginning of the story, or maybe at the end, maybe to have a good laugh is what you talk about. So, but the reason that we use the 2 registers here for tasks, we can see why formal register with its if, then, hypothesis, conclusion, and keeping your syntax in order, why that's important if you want to get lessons learned and you want to solve problems. But in casual register, relationships tend to be important for people, especially for people in poverty, because in poverty, your friends help you stay alive. This is where your extra food may be coming from. This is where a ride to work may be when your car breaks down. So relationships like this are why casual registers is so important and so widely used in poverty. When I first started doing this and doing presentations, I knew it was true, or I should say I suspected strongly that it was true, but I didn't know why. I was doing this one night, and there was a Native American woman there, and she said, when I got to this point, I got done, and she said, you know, you got that casual register thing right. And then she said, when you come to see us on the res, you better be prepared to spend a couple of hours. We're going to sit down and talk to each other and get to know each other. And I thought, oh, yes, of course. Friendships, relationships, they're needed, especially where the going is rough, because you need your friends who are going to help you stay alive. So you can wind up with some problems here, though. Here's one potential problem. This little kid, let's say he's living in poverty, and here's his first day in school, and he wonders what's going on here. He's used to hearing casual register. Everybody around him uses casual register at home, probably. His teacher is now speaking informal register, and that has to do not only with the way we talk, but the way we handle ourselves as we talk. It's going to be more efficient and more efficiently the language school. Well, so we can see how some problems might come up here. I never knew about formal and casual register for all of 33 years I was teaching. So you can see where for the kids that I had in poverty, this is probably something I should have been aware of before, and I had no clue about this. And you can see there might be some potential problems here too. You see here the guidance counselor is talking to the dad, and Jimmy over there has gotten himself into some hot water. I don't know what about. But whatever the counselor is talking about here doesn't seem to be getting across to the parent. And this is a case where maybe casual register, if these people are from poverty, let's say, casual register may be more important here. Possibly the counselor came in and said, okay, came in a formal register way. Okay, we're going to sit down. Let's get right down to the problem here. You know, we'll figure it out and then we'll be on our way. Meanwhile, dad here is thinking, wait a minute, I don't want to get right down to the problem. I don't even know if I can trust this guy. So if the counselor in this case is able to build some trust first with the parent, maybe by some casual register talk at the beginning, maybe this dad is saying to himself soon, I think I can trust this guy. Maybe he's got something to tell me about my kid. So psychologist's posture is formal. That's a sign of formal register too. Dad needs signs of trust. If they can bring that about in that situation, it's helpful. These are some of the things that Hart and Risley found out about recorded vocabulary size by age. And this is where I found out the kids in poverty have half the vocabulary. The children of professional parents have a vocabulary of about 1,116 words. Children of welfare parents have a vocabulary of about 525 words. Now, if we go by stereotypes, this makes a lot of sense. But when we consider that the genetic distribution is the same across humanity, this stops making sense. And I think it points out why we really have to get away from stereotypes and forming opinions from them. Because the genes for these kids are basically the same. So why aren't they the same? Well, children of professional parents, why would they have a bigger vocabulary? Well, They're probably more engaged with formal register. That could be part of it. Another part of it could be parents, children of and parents who are living in welfare are under a lot of stress all the time. They may have a smaller world that they're dealing with. I just have to look at this. Part of mine is blocked out by my. Do you see encourage? Are you? I guess. Are you seeing encouragement and prohibitions by parents per hour?
Yeah.
Are you reading that all? Just nod to me if it looks like that's what you're saying. Okay,
Yeah.
I can't see all of that on my screen. All right. So what happens here is that advantage parents are giving their kids 32 positives and 5 negatives per hour. Parents of poverty are giving their kids 5 positives and 11 negatives per hour. Now again, why would something like this be true? Well, in part, if you're dealing with stress, I can see where a lot of your life is probably going to be dominated by negatives, things that you don't have. The pressure is always on. The pressure is on for food, clothing, shelter, and all of the other things that you have to deal with. Whereas with advantage parents, they've got some other things going for them. I'm not saying that it's a lot easier, that there are no pressures for advantage parents, but probably they're going to be thinking more positively more of the time. And this is the result that happens. I'm gonna just stay on this for a second. No, I'm not. I'm gonna keep going here. Let's take a look at some of the hidden rules of class. This will be the third category here. Whatever class we're in, whether we're in poverty or middle class or wealth, there tend to be these hidden rules that we tend to follow. And these rules number probably in the many thousands, and they get us through even the small decisions that we make, the things that we do during the day. For instance, even with food, even the most basic of items, like food, depend on how we think about them. And this will make some differences in decisions we make regarding food too. For instance, with food in poverty, the question you might hear from the person who prepared the food is, after you have a meal, is, did you have enough? That might very well be spoken because whoever came to the table might not have had the other meals that day, or maybe didn't eat the day before. I know this to be true. There are, just from my experience with the families that I've worked with, food is a major problem. There are hungry people around us. It doesn't seem that's the case, or that could be the case, but it is true. In poverty, this question, did you have enough, is very likely to be asked. In middle class, probably the question to be asked about the meal by the preparer of it would be, did you like it? Do you think they liked it? I grew up middle class. I can still hear my mom saying this now. Wow, do you think they liked it? Is it good? You know, it tends, how the meal, you think about the meal tends to go along that particular rule. And in wealth, was it well presented? That could be a big factor. In other words, if you go to dinner, let's say at the Genesee Valley Club, probably you're going to see something along the lines of this presentation. Is that important? Well, yeah, if you go to the Genesee Valley Club, or maybe Oak Hill, or maybe some really fancy dinner that you go to, this is what you're looking for. and this is what you expect. Is there anything wrong with any of the things that you see above? Well, no. Now, the thing is, depending on the class that you live in, you're probably going to gravitate towards these kinds of thoughts. And so will the people around you. And one of the problems is for people in poverty, especially, if they think about going into another class, in other words, if the opportunity somehow changes in their lives and they have a chance to move into middle class, they've still got to deal with all of the thousands of rules that middle class people know, but people in poverty may not know. In other words, how do you think about food? How do you deal with it? What happens if you go to a restaurant? What do you do there? How do you handle a restaurant? And the things like, where do you put your silverware? How do you eat particular kinds of foods? What kind of foods would be available there? Also start to enter the picture here. So how these things get into, these hidden rules get into us are really up to neural connections that we see, like the ones you see here. Let's say a little boy has just had dinner, and a kid who comes from poverty, mom makes the meal, says after the meal, everybody have enough here? Well, what's going to happen is the child hears that, and that's going to set off some neural connections here to record what she just said. So she says, everybody get enough here. And in his brain cells, you get these cells firing off and making a connection to develop a neural net that helps him remember, in which he remembers now, everybody get enough. That happened when that's what mom said after the meal. Next night, they have dinner again. Mom says, hope everybody get enough food here. That connection. We have the same neural cells firing off again. The next night, same kind of message again after the meal. Well, we know that cells that fire together tend to wire together, and that message then becomes a part of that child. Well, again, that's a different message than he might get from middle class. So again, the hidden rule now starts to become really ingrained in our brains. The hidden rules that we operate on are rules that we just get to learn and know, and they're comfortable for us operating in a particular class that we live in. And let's just take a look at how this works for education. I know one of the stereotypes that we have to be careful about is that you hear is, well, why don't they just go get a job? Why don't they just get educated, in school, stay in school the whole way? Well, let's take a look at that. One of the problems for people in poverty is that in poverty, school cannot come first because survival has to come first. In other words, you have, let's say a girl says to her mom, I have 2 tests tomorrow. And mom says, tomorrow's Monday, you're not going to school tomorrow, you're staying home with these kids, like you do every Monday. She says, I got to take 2 buses to get out to Penfield, clean houses there. So what happens then is that this child misses 2 days, or misses every Monday, and that's 20% of the school week. And actually, the first year I did this, it was when I started tabulating some results on this particular idea. About 20% of the high school kids in the city schools of Rochester were missing 20% of their classes. 20% of the year was gone. So there's a reason then why that happens. Sometimes survival has to come first and will come first. in middle class, school comes first. No matter what, there's enough money around and there's enough resource around. If the kids, you have younger siblings that have to be watched, maybe they'll be going to the Y wraparound program, or maybe the lady down the street gets a few dollars to watch the kids. So sitters are a little bit easier to come by for people in middle class. That doesn't mean that people in middle class have a lot of money, but that means that there is enough to do those kinds of things. And in wealth, actually in wealth, the connection base might come first. School definitely is going to be done, but we're going to get you in the right school, in the right place, and the right kind of connection so that you have advantages when you get out of school. So that's those are the three areas: the interior and hidden rules, and what else? Oh, this course we did, and that brings us about to, this is my whole list here. Do you have any questions, or is there anything that you would like to ask me about